Glad to see you made it out. There's quite a few still in process of getting here on this kind of nasty day. Usually for our guests we have beautiful fall weather, right? But it didn't happen this time. I want to thank Fred Stella, the Patriarch of the West Michigan Hindu Temple, and members of Vahana who have provided us the music to begin with. And to begin our event today, we've asked them to do a musical invocation from the Vedic tradition. And it's the devotional song, Door of My Heart, which has been translated to English. And I'm told that the proper response to a devotional song is silence. So after they're done, let's have a moment of silence, and then we'll begin our program. Fred?
Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Wilt thou come, just for once come to me. Wilt thou come, just for once come to me. Will my days fly away without seeing thee, my Lord? Will my days fly away without seeing thee, my Lord? Night and day, I look for thee night and day. Night and day, I look for thee night and day. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Wilt thou come, just for once come to me. Wilt thou come, just for once come to me. Will my days fly away without seeing thee, my Lord? Will my days fly away without seeing thee, my Lord? Night and day, I look for thee night and day. Night and day, I look for thee night and day. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Wilt thou come, just for once come to me. Wilt thou come, just for once come to me. Will my days fly away without seeing thee, my Lord? Will my days fly away without seeing thee, my Lord? Night and day, I look for thee night and day. Night and day, I look for thee night and day. Night and day, I look for thee night and day. Night and day, I look for thee night and day. Night and day, I look for thee night and day. Night and day, I look for thee night and day. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Door of my heart, open wide I keep for thee. Oh, 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 oh. Oh, oh, oh. Oh, 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 oh,
Thank you, Fred, and your group. Thank you all for coming. We're delighted that you're here. And before we begin, and we also would like to thank and very grateful to our 3 distinguished scholars who you'll hear today. Before we begin, you all should have one of these. If you don't, it's an evaluation form. They're out on the registration table. We really would greatly appreciate your feedback, and leave it before you, if you're staying throughout the day and the evening, that's wonderful. We hope you do. But if you don't, when you attend your last session, would you please fill out the form and leave it? We really take it very seriously. Welcome to the 2015 Jewish Christian Muslim Dialogue. And a special welcome to our speakers and President Haas, who will be, and President Emeritus, President Lubbers. Today's theme, to repair the world, how does religion help or hinder? This is certainly a very relevant topic in today's tumultuous world. This is also one of the concluding events of the Year of Interfaith Service. In 2012, the Kaufman Institute, under the very special, excellent leadership of Doug Kinchy and Katie Gordon, implemented the Year of Interfaith Understanding. And this year, this is one of the concluding events of the Year of Interfaith Service. Many of you were here a couple weeks ago to hear Ubu Patel, founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Corps. That was also one of our culminating events. This year was envisioned by Doug about 2 years ago, and planned and implemented by Doug and Katie Gordon. And they've done an incredible job and really reached the college community and the general community of West Michigan. Thank you, Doug, also for your outstanding leadership as director of the Kaufman Institute. I'm not taking any more time away from our speakers. However, I do want to thank President Tom Haas for being here. He's been a marvelous supporter of the Kaufman Institute, and we wouldn't be where we are without him. And President Haas would like to share a few words.
Well, good morning on this very blustery fall day, and lots of warmth in here, though. Wanted to say again how pleased I am with the leadership of the Kaufman. Sylvia, wonderful opportunity for us to bring people together, especially along the lines of a dialogue. And in order to have that dialogue, you have to have people who are willing to share their perspectives, and I welcome our guests. In order to create an understanding. And Doug Kinchy was really good a couple of times listening him speak about the taxonomy of the understanding that goes into the types of programs that we have here, and especially the understanding when it comes to interfaith. And I think we can rest assured we have great leadership of the institution with the Kaufmans and Doug, because we are providing a space, a safe space, where these conversations, these dialogues can go forward. And if I look at our mission and our new strategic plan, actually, our mission is clear: to shape students' lives, professions, and our societies. And this particular institute, this particular opportunity we have here to come together is so aligned with that mission. It really is the essence then of our mission. And these topics and these opportunities we have will in fact positively impact the societies, whether it be local right here in Grand Rapids or West Michigan, but when we look and focus in on what our students are doing beyond these environments in the rest of the world, we are making a significant opportunity for them to grow and learn and the like. So our strategic plan is looking ahead to 2021, and these types of programs, this institute, along with other institutes and centers of excellence, we call them. This is definitely one of those centers of excellence to go forward in a track line that enables student success, enables the success of our faculty and staff, enables the success of our region. And so again, I always look for those types of alignments. And the Kaufman Center is so much in that alignment that we can, again, provide these opportunities for all of us to learn. And we're living in an environment, as we know, globally that is challenged, especially in this particular area, in interfaith conflicts, as we know. But we also have other ways that this program also aligns itself, say, with the Hallenstein Center on Common Ground. And those two programs, again, resonate with our mission, resonate with our way forward with our strategic plan. So I'm looking forward to today, again, welcoming our guests here, listening, and hopefully engaging in dialogue to really obtain that understanding, and maybe understanding of who we are as a person and as a people. So I welcome you on behalf of now well over 25,000 students we have here at Grand Valley State University, and our faculty and staff as well. So welcome, and we'll get on with the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Haas. Excuse me. 9 years ago, when he first came to Grand Valley as president, one of the first events was welcoming this group for our Interfaith Dialogue at that time. And we had, at that time, we also had Rabbi Donniel Hartman, who was one of our main speakers at that time. And so we were so privileged and honored that this would be one of your first events. We assume it's not your last, but we've had wonderful support from President Haas and from the administration at Grand Valley and from our community. The Kaufman Interfaith Institute is really a community effort, and we are moving more aggressively now on campus to develop programs for students. So it's the next generation that have the most to gain or the most to lose if we don't solve some of these problems. So anyway, I also want to welcome you to this event and introduce our program. As many of you have been here before, you know how it works. We have 3 rounds and then an evening session. Each one begins with one of our faith representatives with responses then from the other 2, and then we open it up for questions and answers from the audience. Our first speaker, who has been here 3 or 4 times at least, is Rabbi Donniel Hartman, who is the president of the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He received his PhD in Jewish philosophy from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and has been an outstanding leader, not only in the Jewish community, but in interfaith work all over the world. And so it's a real honor to have Dr. Rabbi Donniel Hartman with us again. Please, Donniel.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's very nice to be here again. As I travel around the United States, and it's a very, very profound lesson to know that here in Grand Rapids, something special is happening that the rest of the country could learn from. And that all of us, you speak about centers of excellence and impacting the world. And this is an example of, no matter where you are, you can do something of national and international significance. So it is really an honor and a privilege to be here. It's also an honor to be with my 2 colleagues, Cynthia and Ingrid. It's also very nice to be the token man on a panel for once. I feel so special. And now we get to talk about some difficult things. Now we get to talk about what's wrong. Because the chances are if there's a conflict anywhere in the world today, chances are, if there is an individual who believes that they have a right to cause harm and pain to others, that they will be motivated by and inspired by their life of faith. If in the 20th century the conflicts were primarily, my nation is bigger or better, or should be bigger and better than yours, in the 21st century, the evil of isms has been replaced by the evil of religion. Now, our primary excuse, and let's remember, I make a very good living from being in the religion business, so I don't want to knock it too much. There is something counterproductive. But the argument is, our religions are just fine. We're doing great. Why all this evil? Why all this failure? Why is it that all the conflicts are perpetrated in the name of religion? The fundamental core answer is some version of original sin. By which I mean, religion is fine. Don't worry, everything is great. It's people. It's people. The flesh is weak. People are imperfect. People are flawed. If only people would be more religious. If they would be truly religious. If they'd listen more carefully to what their traditions really say, then everything would be simply fine. Salvation is still achievable. We will save ourselves and save our world primarily by being more dedicated rather than less dedicated. We fail not because religion is flawed, but because we are flawed. Now, there is no doubt we are flawed. There is no doubt that human beings are imperfect. There is no doubt that the flesh is weak. That would explain, however, why religious people also fail. But why is it that religion seems to motivate evil? Why does it seem to be that religion is the catalyst for evil? So new atheists say, let's give it up. Enough. Let's save the world by getting rid of religion. It's an interesting proposition. One that I'm not invested in. But there's something flawed about that argument because it's not speaking to us as human beings. We are people of faith. We have to find a way as people of faith to correct what we're doing. The solution of giving up on the enterprise might be, I don't know whether, I'm not that impressed by the ethics of people outside of a world of faith, but even assuming that there might be some theoretical solution, it's not a solution for the majority of human beings who want to walk and build a life with God. Don't tell me to give up. I'm not giving up my life with God. Our challenge is not a challenge of how we answer the new atheists. Our challenge is a challenge of how do we answer ourselves. As people committed to a life of faith, how do we respond? Why is our religious life underachieving in a perpetual way? I want to posit that there is something flawed in the life of monotheism. And that we are obligated to understand it, and only if we understand it is it possible for us to correct it. and that it doesn't serve us well to close our eyes and to say, oh, our religion is fine. There's something that we're doing wrong. Now, one of the rules of interfaith learning and conversation is that each one of us speaks from within our tradition. I want to speak about a phenomena within monotheism, but I am taking total responsibility and only speaking about the flaw from within the Jewish tradition. Whether people here of other faith communities feel that it is applicable to them, please join in your own reflections. If not, just give me support for the work that I alone have to do. And sometimes support is comforting. I believe that the life of faith, I want to argue, suffers from an autoimmune disease. I don't know if any of you ever had an autoimmune disease. I did. They're not pleasant. Depends which ones. For a number of years of my life, I had a neuromuscular autoimmune disease. I'm fine now. I remember trying to brush my teeth. And I couldn't hold the toothbrush. Couldn't. I had to use my other hand to hold my toothbrush in the evening. I suffered from myasthenia gravis. Couldn't. And like you're willing it. The experience of an autoimmune disease, there's something in your body that's attacking itself. It's not allowing you to do that which is natural, that which you want to do. And it's so frustrating. Like, I want to brush my teeth. I want to keep my eyelids open. I can't. Why is this happening to me? Not in the sense of why is God doing this to me, but who's in control of my body? Something is going on inside that is attacking the body's desire and yearning to do that which it wants to do. What happens if a life of faith suffers from a similar predicament? What happens if God commands the good? Love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord your God. What could be clearer than that? You shall love the stranger, and the stranger shall be to you as one of your citizens. What could be clearer than that? God could look back and say, I told them. What do you want from me? I told them. But what happens if when God enters the room, when God enters your soul and your mind, that experience inadvertently begins to attack the goals that God and you and your religious system have? Monotheism is particularly challenged. Idolatry had it much better. And it's worthwhile for us to admit it. They were smaller. It was the God of my family, the God of my country. But we posit this notion of one transcendent being, the Lord of the universe. There is no God but God. All of our traditions, God is the central force. Once God enters into our consciousness, now whether God exists or we create God or we envision this one transcendent being, we've invested so much in that oneness that God changes the equation. That when God enters into the room, by definition, the order of things, the priority of things is transformed. I want to speak about that phenomenon. I want to speak about two particular aspects of that autoimmune disease. One that I call God intoxication, and the other that I call God manipulation. Both expressions of something that happens. And what's so interesting, as we know from our prophets, God is not aware of the impact that God has on people. And God's profoundly frustrated by it. That's what the prophets say. Isaiah. God says to the Jewish people, what are you doing here? Why are you showing up in the temple? Like, what are you doing? Like, I'm nauseous. This is literally, I can't handle this anymore. Get out of here. What are you bringing me goats for? Who asked you for a cow? Like, I'm like, every time you show up, it ruins my day. This is Isaiah. Don't blame me. If you think this is what can we do? This is sacred scripture. God says literally these words, who asked this of you? What's the answer of who asked this of you? Moses, and if Moses, then whom? You're saying to me, who asked? But did you forget about the book of Leviticus? You're the one who told me to show up on the new moons and on Sabbaths and on all these holidays. You told me every time there's a holiday, bring a cow. So I bring a cow. This is what you told me. You want a goat for this holiday, you get a goat. For this one, you get a cow, and this one an ox. This is what you detailed. The whole book of Leviticus and Numbers are filled with half of the 613 commandments of the Bible. Half pertain to temple worship. And now you and Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, are saying, who asked this of you? What, do you have amnesia? It's like, somehow you forgot the sacred scriptures? You asked it. But God doesn't know. He said, what's going on? Because something happens to us as people. There's something nuclear about a life of faith that if we don't know how to control, it's going to be destructive. And it is destructive. And so I don't want to speak about original sin. While that's there and we have to be better within our life of faith, I want to speak about something internally flawed about religion, and the patient that I want to speak about today is Judaism. The fundamental ethical impulse of Judaism, the foundation of moral responsibility to another in the Jewish tradition could be summarized with the words, you shall not remain indifferent. Deuteronomy says if you see your brother or sister's ox going astray, or in Exodus they speak about if you see your enemy's ox going astray, you have choices to make. You're in the public sphere. You see a goat. You see an ox. You can look at it and say, my lucky day. Where's the owner? Not to be found. Their loss is my gain. Good day. I can even couch it in theological terms. Why am I here at the same moment that this goat is? God provides in mysterious ways. God, listen, thank you, God. Our tradition says, you shall not remain indifferent. Return it. The fundamental moral code of the Jewish tradition is that you have to see the other in their needs and in their pain, and you have to see yourself as part of the solution. That is the essential feature of all of biblical ethics and of Jewish law. Do not remain indifferent. In many ways, Judaism obligates you to be the antithesis of Cain. God says to Cain in Genesis 4, where is your brother? And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? And the essence of Jewish law is you are your brother's keeper. And you have an obligation to walk through the world and to see. To see the lost ox and goat. To see someone's financial and emotional needs. To see somebody's inalienable rights as a being created in the image of God. To see wherever it is falling short wherever they are in need, and you are obligated not merely to have compassion, not merely to pray. It is your obligation to be part of the solution and to help solve and return to them that which is rightfully theirs. And what's rightfully theirs is a life of dignity, of freedom, of food, of shelter. You have to see. The argument that I'd like to make is that it is precisely here that a life of faith could be very, very challenging. Because what monotheism has the potential to create is blindness, is short-sightedness. Short-sightedness when it comes to human beings, as distinct from short-sightedness when it comes to God. What monotheism has the potential to create is a human being who believes that that which they must be the least indifferent to is God. That if I really believe God entered into the room, that's who I see. The flesh is indeed weak. Humans are indeed limited, but the limitation is that when God enters into the room, we don't have the ability sometimes to balance. When they're showing up in the temple and right afterwards they're doing injustice, God is saying to them, "What are you doing?" And they're saying, "I'm serving you." And God said, "Who asked this of you?" And not fully understanding the impact that God has on people. God intoxication. There's a very famous rabbi in the Jewish tradition, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who was lived in the 2nd century, a man of great faith. And the Talmud tells of a conflict that he had with the Roman Empire. He critiqued them, and they didn't appreciate it. And so they sentenced him to death. And according to the Talmud in Tractate Shabbat, he runs away with his son, and he hides in a cave. And a tree magically sprouts. Do trees sprout? Grew. Tree grew with fruit. And a river miraculously was formed. So he and his son were able to drink and to sustain themselves for 12 years. And in this cave, the opposite of Plato's cave, they engaged in the contemplation of God's being and God's will. Every day, they studied. According to our tradition, they actually buried themselves in sand. They were brains. And they talked. They would get out of the sand just to pray, and then they'd go back again. And they lived like this for 12 years. Just like this. They pursued the intellectual engagement with the one God and the word of the one God. After 12 years, Elijah comes to the entrance of the cave and says, "Who will tell Shimon that the Romans no longer are searching for you?" And he discovers that he can leave, and he leaves the cave. He and his son leave the cave, and they see someone, according to our tradition, they see a Jewish farmer plowing the land. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, "You are leaving that which is eternal, neglecting the eternal, and dealing with the temporal. Whoever they would see was killed with the fire of their eyes." If you truly love God, how could you engage in everyday life? If you truly love God, you should be this. Your priorities are off. Our ability to kill in the name of God, our ability to kill people because somehow we believe they aren't showing the proper respect to God that God deserves, is the essence of God intoxication and the essence of one of the autoimmune diseases of religious life. God enters into the room, and for many, by definition, human beings become less important. He doesn't see the people. He's doing an act of great piety. God then comes down and says, have you left your cave to destroy my world? Return to your cave. We thought that God liked the cave because God gave them the river and God gave them the tree. But in fact, God says, it's your cave. And they go back. And they stay there, according to our tradition, 11 months, which is equivalent to the amount of time that the wicked have to spend in hell. The cave, which they thought was heaven, is now hell. And they leave the cave. Now they know what God wants, correct? But again, anybody whom they see engaging in everyday life, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's son, burns them to death. You just heard God tell you, this is not what, have you left the cave to destroy my world? And they come out, and one of the features of God intoxication is that in the name of God, you actually know what God wants more than God's self. Does that sound familiar? I know what God wants. I know what Scripture really means. We believe in the one transcendent God, but we don't create the framework within our lives for that one transcendent God to not destroy our world. God manipulation works in a very different way. God intoxication is when God, the infinite being, takes up all the room and by definition creates a secondary status for the ethical. Human beings come second. And you believe that a life of faith requires that human beings come second. That's simply the meaning of living with God. That's what it means to be a religious person. God comes first. It's actually almost tautological. That is embedded within the idea. If you truly understand who it is that you're talking about, you will reprioritize your life. That is one core essential teaching and consequence of a life of faith. There is a second one, which is equally destructive, but it comes in a different form. And it's one of the great tragedies of monotheism in general, and I'm speaking in the name of Judaism today, or the Judaism that I have studied and worked in my whole life. If there's one God, then that one God has to love somebody best. Who does God love best? Now, what happens with God manipulation is that when God enters into the room, we have a yearning to be loved best. We have a yearning not merely to worship that God, but we have a yearning that that God, who we need to walk with us through the valley of the shadow of death, will love us in particular. And the idea of one God gives birth to God manipulation, in which we believe that this God not merely loves us best, but loves the other less. Deuteronomy 20 is one of the most powerful chapters of God manipulation. When you go to war against your enemies, have no fear, the Bible says. For the God who rescued you and redeemed you from Egypt will be with you. God enters into the room, and I yearn to be the chosen one. Because there's not enough God to go. God is so important. My whole life is going to be determined by whether I am the chosen one. And there's not enough blessings to go around. And there's not enough love to go around. And one God activates this human jealousy to be the most beloved. And in the name of God, it's not that I don't see you because I see God. It's that in the name of God, all I see is me. God either causes a moral blindness by restructuring our priorities to be to focus exclusively or primarily on serving God, regardless of what God says. Or God causes us to activate a Yetzer Hara, an evil inclination, to somehow have God love me and be on my side. And when I kill, and when I maim, and when I ignore, God gives me the justification. Because I'm never fighting against my enemies. No, a religious person would never do that. I'm fighting against God's enemies. And so a life of faith has this profound potential to derail moral impulse, to derail the obligation to see somebody, to hear your story, to see your needs, and to be motivated and inspired to respond. And it's not that God doesn't tell us to do so. It's just when you have an autoimmune disease, you can try as much as you want. You just can't lift your hand. You can't open your eyes to see what in the name of your faith you are causing. I'm going to talk about this more tonight, but on one foot. So where do we go? Now, for people of faith, we have no choice. God is in my room. I could look at this autoimmune disease, but if you take God out of the room, it's like a successful operation and the patient dies. You can't take God out of my life. But how do I protect myself? I don't have the choice, nor would I want the choice of walking without God. But how do I immune myself from this autoimmune disease that is embedded within our traditions now for 2,000 years? And history has taught us that we are profoundly in its clutches. What I argue, and on this I just completed a book that's coming out shortly in February 16. The telephone number of Amazon. No, I'm just is that a life of faith requires that we put God second. that if you want to put God's will first, that a life of faith requires that we put God second. And here we have to fight against the fundamental instinct of monotheism, in which God, by definition, embedded in God's being, is the idea that God has to be first. There's two ways that we put God first. And I'd like to teach one more rabbinic, one more Talmudic page, or saying, and with that conclude. Hillel and Shammai, who lived slightly before the Common Era, about the time of Jesus, were two of the greatest rabbis of their period. They never agreed on anything. But it was beautiful because they created a core foundation of the Jewish tradition that Judaism is something that we debate and argue with each other, and that there's always more than one possible authentic Jewish response to any question. And Hillel and Shammai coexisting within one tradition become the paradigm that there is no such thing as Judaism. At best, you have Judaisms. There was once someone who wanted to convert, and he comes to Shammai and says, "Teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot." Some of you might know this story. Shammai looks at him and says, "What, are you crazy?" Kicks him out of the room. You want to convert? I want blood. I want sweat. I want tears. Give me 3 years and I'll get, and you know, we want to make sure of your motivation and whether you really know. If you want to convert, you have to go through extensive basic training. You want it on one foot? Not interested. Comes before Hillel, who converts him on the spot. Hillel had an ideology that the mere desire to be a Jew was the only necessary criteria to be Jewish. And then welcome into the story. You might be a good Jew, you might be a bad Jew. That's what Jews are. People are. You know, you want to be? Okay, come on in, now live your life. There's some better, some worse, and he converts him. And then Hillel says, I understand what you're asking. He says, you're asking me, what's the essence of Judaism? And Hillel answers, the essence of Judaism is that what is hateful unto you, do not do unto others. That is the whole Torah, and the rest is commentary. Go and study. Who's not mentioned in Hillel's answer? Rashi, the 10th century commentator, has a heart attack. How could this be? You're talking about the essence of, you could have said two things. You had 1 foot, you could have had another sentence. It's like a person could handle more than one sentence while they're standing on 1 foot. You could have just mentioned, I think maybe you forgot something. So he reinterprets Hillel and to say, what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others. The other is God. It's not your neighbor, it's God. And just as God doesn't like it when you don't listen to God, just like you don't like it when people don't listen to you, so too God doesn't like it when you don't listen to God. And therefore, what is hateful unto you, do not do unto God, means listen to everything that God commands you. People, that's his interpretation. Because how could you leave God out of the room? Hillel says, however, I'm not leaving God out of the room. Hillel's whole life was a life of faith, a life of devotion to God. But if you ask me, what's my priority? If I have only one thing to say, it's what is hateful unto you, do not do unto others. And what's most revolutionary is when Hillel says, this is the whole Torah and the rest is commentary. What do you mean this is the whole Torah? Is this the whole Torah? What about Shabbos? What about prayer? What about Sabbath? What does it mean this is the whole Torah, the rest is commentary? That means at any given time, and this is the secret, the first stage of healing ourselves from this autoimmune disease, is that if at any time there is a perceived conflict between a life of faith and your moral obligation to see others, seeing others and responding morally is the whole Torah, and all the rest is commentary. You have to interpret your religious life in such a way that the ethical will always be primary. And it is God who commands you to do so, but because of the autoimmune disease, you can't hear. How we create a life in which the ethical is primary with God in the room is one of the essential challenges of a life of faith. And monotheism will be a gift to the world only when we answer that question. Only when we find out how to do that. But there's one last stage to Hillel's answer, which is a response to divine or to God manipulation. When we manipulate God to serve our own national needs, when we manipulate God and our life of faith and our tradition to serve my own self-aggrandizement. And I say, it's not me. It's not me. Scripture told me to kill them. God told me he hates them. The first antidote is the primacy of the ethical. The second is the independence of the ethical. As long as revelation is the source of our knowledge of the good, our religious traditions will always be able to manipulate that good. It is only when we believe that the ethical is independent of religion and obligates religion as it obligates us that any interpretation in the name of faith which allows for evil is by definition a distortion of that religious life. When Hillel said, what is hateful unto you, do not do unto others, what could he have quoted? Ladies and gentlemen, give me a verse. What could he have quoted? No, not do unto others. It's close, but what does the Bible say? Do unto others is a similar version of that. What does Leviticus 19 say? Love thy neighbor as thyself. You know, it's a little different. I know we rabbis, we could have a whole weekend retreat on the difference between them. But like, frankly, if Hillel would have said, what is love your neighbor as yourself, this is the whole Torah, the rest is commentary, we would have been just fine, gotten the same point. Hillel quotes a verse, quotes a sentence, doesn't quote it, makes up, constructs a sentence, which has no prior revelatory source. He could have, it was right there. Love your neighbor as yourself, and would have done all the work he needs. Hillel says the secret to Jewish life is to both accept the primacy of the good, that you can't stand before God unless you understand that loving your neighbor as yourself is the whole Torah and the rest is commentary. But you also can't stand within our tradition unless you accept that you have a moral obligation to do the good, independent of what anybody manipulates tradition to say. Because the source of the good is not Scripture. The devil quotes Scripture. The source of the good and the corrective to the good has to be a moral life which stands outside, independent of, and serves as the corrective of. People of faith generally have no choice. God is a part of our life, and the option of God not being part of our life is irrelevant. It's irrelevant. It's just not something that conceptually it's not a path that I could even conceptually envision. God is here to stay, and I want God to be here to stay. But as a Jew, I want more from Judaism and more from monotheism than what we've delivered for the first 2,000 years. We entered into the world. Monotheism is the first enlightenment. Monotheism promised to save the world from the moral corruption and barbarism of idolatry. Will we succeed? We succeed not merely the moment we become people of faith in the one God. We succeed when our faith in that one God becomes a source of kindness and decency. Religion is about creating a life of value. And our test is to ensure that our lives and the lives of people around us become more valuable, precisely because of our faith. And it is my profound belief that you put God first by putting God second. Thank you.
Well, thank you for a very challenging message. And now I'm going to ask Dr. Reverend Cynthia Campbell and Dr. Ingrid Mattson to respond from their religious perspectives, and then we'll open up after that for questions and answers.
You want us to just come up and
Yeah, one at a time. Yeah. No, just one at a time, then we'll all gather after.
Okay. Pardon us while we get our choreography straight. It is always such a profound pleasure to learn from Rabbi Hartman. This year, as 3 years ago, there's so many places to engage this, and thank you so much. So, to begin at the end, I wonder if where you end up is not, frankly, where Dawkins and Harris want to end up. That is, that there's access to the good, to notions of justice, ethical responsibility, completely independent of any God. So why not just live that way? Which I think on one level is an argument that's patently true. People have argued for notions of goodness and of justice independent of religious authorization for centuries. And I think it's perfectly possible to do that. On the other hand, it does seem to me that part of the essence of a monotheistic tradition, certainly of a Christian tradition, is that there are values embedded in who we think God is. God is not simply an abstract idea or one that reveals God's self. God has a character, and it's the very character of God, I think, I as a Christian want to say, sets the bar, the basis of our ethical understanding. How do we know what goodness is? How do we know what, speaking as a Christian, what love looks like? Well, we look to the being of God. We look to God's behavior, God's self-disclosure. Which gets to, it seems to me, I love this notion of God intoxication and God manipulation. I think this is just a wonderful way of looking at some of the problems. It strikes me that the fundamental question one has to ask is, what is the nature of the God in whom one believes? Who is this God that comes in and takes us over as believers? Finally, I guess I would say, seems to me that your presentation gets to the question, well, how would we even know that we have an obligation to the other? What is the source of that idea? It does not seem to me, and I guess I probably betray too much of my own Christianity here, it does not seem to me that this is self-evident. now, parenthetically, there's honestly an interesting conversation going on now among ethobiologists, biologists who are thinking about ethics and the pattern of the brain, and a discussion about whether or not altruistic behavior is a part of natural selection, that doing good to others actually makes it easier for better for people to survive, easier for people, and so natural selection gets you more moral people. I've only read enough to be dangerous on this topic. Instinctively, as a Christian, this does not make sense to me, that we have to learn actually how to care for others, and we do that in part out of our, a religious tradition is one way to learn that. So those are just a few kind of comments back, but thank you for a fabulous, fabulous presentation.
Oh, good morning. This is harder than giving your own talk. It's really challenging. Yeah. Thank you so much. I haven't come to this event before, and it's just fabulous. I'm really honored and excited to be here. Let me first say that the beginning of my challenge is some of the language, and I just have to, I mean, I hate to look like the pious, so sort of the preserver of pieties, but there's a certain way to talk about God that that to me preserves my place in that relationship. So even some of the language about God coming into a room is an almost is a kind of personification that makes me uncomfortable. And maybe that's part of understanding where I'm looking at, as Cynthia does, the source of ethics, is that this is, it's not that God comes in the room, it's that to deny that all of this is God's room is the basic, is a basic issue. I take issue with your assessment that reality, that religion is the source of conflict in the world today. I mean, that might sound like a complete act of denial, but it all begins with categorization. And as we know, that if you miscategorize something, miscategorize facts, then you're going to end up with the wrong solution. I mean, if you mistake a sheep for a goat, then no matter how well your zakat or your charity calculations are, you're going to end up with the wrong results because the fact is wrong. I would say that a lot of evil in the world is being justified as a good thing, and because of that, we don't see the evil. And I see a lot of war and violence being inflicted on people, but because it's in the name of security or protection, it is not being classified as evil. Whether it has to do with evils within our own country, President Obama mentioned very bravely, I think, but it's always easy to be brave when you can no longer be reelected, and it's very free to speak all your moral convictions as a political leader. When he said that 100 people in America have been killed by terrorists since 9/11, but 400,000 people have been killed by gun violence in this country since that time. When I look at the drone program, when I look at billions of dollars in military aid to repressive regimes, I see a lot of evil, and it is all behind the cover of security and national interests. And I see some of the bravest voices against them are religious, like the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, which has been an amazing, brave and moral, courageous leader in denouncing and really changing policies on torture, solitary confinement, drone warfare, and other things. So I'm not here to be just the defender of religion, because I agree with you that nevertheless, religion has been used and is used as a justification for violence. It is possibly even a motivation for violence. Certainly is in some cases. Whether we understand that as a motivation or a justification is almost a psychological difference or distinction without much of a difference in fact. And I agree, and I think the really profound and moving point that you make is the problem of the effacement of ethics in the name of religion. How can that so consistently happen? Where religion is substituted for ethics again and again and again. And it is a profound reality. This semester I happen to be teaching Islamic ethics, and the problem that we see is that over and over, the Quran and other prophetic norms will be, the ethical arguments and concepts in them will be reinterpreted or equated to religion. So, for example, when the Quran speaks about righteousness, good, virtue, that again and again we see over time increasingly the tendency of the commentators to say, well, what is good is what God commands. What is virtuous is what God commands. What is righteousness is obedience to God, denying that there's any objective reality to this. The question is, how do we build structures and systems of protecting ethics? And that is really where the rubber hits the road, and where I think, and I'm quite convinced, that the constant presence of the religious other is necessary for that, which is why I really believe that interfaith education, conversations, and engagement are the only way to protect that from happening, perhaps, or the most effective way. And that's something we can speak more about today.
I think before we open up for questions, we already have a bunch of questions, and so I think we'll let Rabbi Donniel Hartman respond to some of the challenges and comments that have been made by our other two presenters, and maybe a little bit of interaction at the table, and then we'll open it up. I hope you'll be agreeable to that, so please.
Cynthia, I truly also preferred when I got to talk alone. It also was much easier. No, but I very much appreciate both of your comments, because you're both pushing to either a weakness or the edginess or the problematic. And the difference between weakness, edginess, or problematic depends on who you ask. What do you need God for? If God is second, if God is not the source of the good, what do you need God for? And in fact, in the book, which is coming out on
the title of which is?
I have a chapter, because you're right. The question is, one of the chapters of the book is, do you have to believe in God in order to be a good Jew? Because is a consequence of this making God unnecessary. And your question, regardless of what I answer, is not going to go away. And it is true, it's the danger of what I'm talking. There is an inherent danger of that. I am playing with fire, with theological fire. And I do so consciously because I feel the opposite has led us astray. Now I know, and Ingrid as well, I know that there are many people for whom, including myself, I hope, some of the time, for whom my religious life is a catalyst for the good. Nor am I making religion the sole cause. My remarks would not be understood correctly if you would hear me as saying that the sole cause for evil is faith. That indeed, Ingrid, would be calling a goat a cow and then trying to figure out there's other stuff going on. You're absolutely right. I'm not here to dump on religion and to make it the sole guilty party for the world in which we live. But as religious people, and in your own remarks gave evidence to it, but as religious people, we have a problem because it's not sufficient that we're no better than, or that we are also one of the causes of. I want to understand why exactly, and again, if I'm misquoting what you said, tell me, but because I see it in my tradition all the time. When the tradition says do the righteous, and then doing the righteous becomes fulfilling God's will, that is precisely the autoimmune disease that we can't help ourselves. There are religious leaders, great ones, who their life of faith causes them to stand up with great courage and to ask the fundamental question or the fundamental challenge to the argument of safety and security, and that is safety and security for what end? The voice of religion asks and challenges us to say, I know that you want to live, but the value of life depends on living a life of value. And that message is a profoundly religious one. And there are religious figures who do stand up and do so. Our world, though, is filled with religious figures who are doing the opposite. And forget our world, Judy, my tradition, my job, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement in the Jewish tradition, the core prayer is called vidui, the confession. And it's one of the most beautiful prayers that we have. The only problem is we put so many words before it and after, it's just you're exhausted by the time you get there. Again, that might be an experience that some of you are familiar with. But the essence of that prayer is Ashamnu, you go like you beat your heart. Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu. You take every letter of the alphabet and you say, I have done something wrong. I have sinned in the letter A, there's a letter B, there's a letter C, there's a letter D. I have sinned. What you don't do is, you have sinned. Like that would be a nice one. You have sinned, I have sinned. One of the great challenges of the state of Israel, country in which I live, in which I'm proud to live in, is that now that the Jewish people have returned to power, how do we use that power? It's a great challenge. And in my country, more often than not, the people who speak from within religious tradition are the ones for whom their life of faith allows them to be morally blind to the needs of others. Now, and you ask me, I don't want the solution to be Hitchens. I don't want the solution to be, so let's give up on religion. Let's get rid of the rabbis. Not the rabbis here in Grand Rapids. Let's get rid of them. Let's do I want to fight within religious tradition for a different nuance. That a life, that I believe in God, that I love God, that I walk with God, but that my love and life with God has to be put into a perspective. And that I know is where I'm dancing, where yours. Now here, this comes, see, part of being the Jews, we don't have to be irreverent. We don't have to be reverent, excuse me. Like, we don't have to. It's like we go back, like, you know, the way, like, with God, we talk. We talk, we argue. We do lots of stuff, which in other traditions is very heretical. And I accept that and appreciate that. But here, and that's why all of your questions, I so much appreciate them, and you're right. I would posit it this way, and with that, well, do we need a little heresy? It's like, do we need a spice of heresy to be good people of faith? Do we need a little perspective? Or is God just simply, you know, again, I was speaking metaphorically. Okay, it is God's room. Great, that's the problem. It's God's room and we went into the room. And now how are you supposed to function in God's room? And God, according to my understanding of my tradition, says, when you're in my room, I want you to be really aware of all the other human beings in my room. And that's a condition of the rent. But we go in, and all we could think, it's God's room. We have to fight that. The alternative of saying, okay, so you're close to, you're getting close to making God, is it stopping? It is coming close, I know. It is. And both of you challenged me, rightfully so. I think that danger is necessary for us to redeem religion from itself.
I guess what I would say to that is that you're giving a perfect example of the self-correcting instinct that is, I think, inside of biblical religion and especially Judaism as I know it. That there is, and I think is in monotheism, is that there is this impetus to self-correct, to stand over against, to judge, to reform. I come from a tradition that's called Reformed, and we see that as one of the instincts that grows up out of the tradition itself. So, I mean, in some ways it looks to me like you're not making a critique the way Dawkins and Harris do, but actually from within, which I think is very healthy.
And thank you. And just one last thing, because you spoke very beautifully, and maybe there is a subtle difference between Judaism and Christianity here, which I really want to think about for a while. I don't know the answer. Where you speak about how God's personification is a model for how you know what kindness, love, and gentleness are. For me, religion is not the source of the good, and God's character is not the source of the good. God is the reminder of the good. And the job of, we know the good, but the flaw is not in the fact that we don't know what is the good, but in the fact that we don't do the good. And the job of religion is not to teach us what is the good, but to remind us of the good that we know. And so God, when God models it, that's precisely what God does. Because if we didn't know otherwise, we wouldn't have even been able to identify that as the good. And we would know, like, what is it, what about God's wrath? There's a lot of stuff there. What is it that we pick to personify that which we want to emulate? And what is that we pick, that we decide to sort of make an exception somehow, and we read them quickly in Hebrew or Latin? Like we just sort of let it go. What do we emphasize? What is it that you speak about?
Right.
You will give sermons, on Exodus. You'll pick your chapters, and there's going to be chapters that will never appear from your pulpit. You'll never will. They never are there.
Yep.
And you just have to hope that your community is moderately illiterate.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that this afternoon. That's exactly
No, you're going to have
what we do.
because you're picking. But how do we even know what to pick? That's why it's only when God is the reminder. When I come with being created in the image of God, I come with the power to know that I'm able to discern. Religion is invaluable in creating a life of ethical, but it's only when we come with some criteria which precede it.
So maybe we'll have more. We're going to be here all day, so we might have.
That's been making
more
you nervous
time.
since last night.
It has been. I know. I'm like, how are we going to get through this
I'm
day?
nice most of the time.
But the second oldest theological controversy in Islam is about the source of the good, and whether good is created by God, or whether the good is what God commands. So does what God commands, is that how we know what is good, or is good what God does God command good? So goodness has a objective reality. In the end, there are two schools that come out of this, but in the end, it's really reduced to the same thing, because even those who say that what is good is what God decides is good, nevertheless say, and it was God's wisdom to make sure that what he decided is good is actually good. So it pretty much comes down to the same thing. So what's the distinction here? What does this come down to that relates to what you say? Is that the main problem is that people, and this is why we need God, or this is why we need to recognize God, not why we need God, because God exists. Whether you accept God's existence or not, God exists. What we need to do is recognize God, because otherwise we confuse our own desires with this good and with what God created as good or designated as good. This is why the Quran says, "Do you take your own desires as God, as your God?" And this is why the Islamic statement of faith, the first thing we say, before there's any affirmation of God, we have to say there's no God. La ilaha. There is no God, there's no gods, and then we can affirm illallah, except for God, which means that most of our work is the deconstruction, is erasing and liberating and cleaning out of our hearts, of all of our desires, interests, all of the things that we mistake for God. We can't do that alone. I mean, ethical formation is about how do we do it. It's not you go and sit by yourself and you come up with it. No, it has to be through interaction with other people who correct us, remind us, who mirror, we see in them the effects of our action. So that's moral formation. And that's what, just because we've mentioned Dawkins, I was, a few years ago, I was asked to speak in Toronto at the City of Ideas. Moses Neimer is a very famous media person and owner in Canada, has this great yearly program called City of Ideas. And it's where, this was before TED Talks or anything, I think it actually was almost the model for it, where someone goes up and for 20 minutes speaks on a subject on a stage. And I was told I was going to be on the kind of religion slate. There would be me, there would be a rabbi, there would be a Christian pastor, and that we were the religion people. And then I got there, and I was told that in fact the person I was going to be the first of the religion, but I was going to be going immediately after Richard Dawkins. So he was going to be setting the foundation, the frame for the whole discussion. Thank you very much, just told me about it. So I mean, on the spot, I'm quickly just thinking, oh my God, like this it's a completely different thing now. But then when I thought about it in terms of the Shahada, I said, no, it's all right. Because what he's saying is really, he's helping us with the first part of this. And that's where I believe there is a really important and profound and necessary interaction with those who are engaged in deconstruction religion, including ourselves, which is to recognize all of those things that we've made into God that in fact are not, that are just ourselves, whether it's personal interests, national interests, or whatever it is. So to that extent, I think it's very helpful. The problem is that once that's done, and it's the same way I felt when I did my undergraduate degree in philosophy and finished with my class on Derrida, and I got to the end, it's like, is that all there is, my friends? Like, where's we've just deconstructed everything. Now what do we do? What do we do? And I think the most important thing is that what needs to fill that space is gratitude, really. Like, that's the piety. The piety is that, and gratitude is tied to humility, which is what will give us morality, that I did not create any of my capacities. I did nothing to be born in this family, this place, have this body, none of this. And that, I think that is the truly pious attitude that then allows us to seek that morality. Otherwise, we're constantly deceived into thinking that we are self-made, people.
I can't resist taking advantage of the position of moderator, and I wanna tweak a little bit the putting God second. I know it makes a great book title, and a provocative, as you say, on the edge of danger, but could we nuance that by saying putting our concept of God second? And also regarding religion, having values is wonderful, but that's kind of abstract. And as a professor, I know it's really hard to get students to accept all these abstract concepts. Doesn't the role of religion and the role of narrative in religion propel and carry these values? Isn't that how the values get transmitted? It is through narrative and story. And anyway, if you can respond briefly, and then we'll have people at the mic, so you can start lining up if you want, to prevent me from asking any more questions.
I think there is no doubt that narrative is the way we carry our values. That we don't live in the world of universal concepts. We don't. And in each one of our tradition, we have a second stage of the Shahadat, which is the particular narrative through which we believe that the Word of God is carried. And it must be so. But the only way that we know or can ensure that our particular narrative is carrying that which it ought to carry is if it lives up to certain core universal truths and knowledges that human beings have qua human beings, as human beings. And otherwise, then we really have the goat and the cow. Then we really don't have a clue. Because we don't even know what to make of the words. We don't know where to put commas. We don't know where to put periods. Thou shalt not kill should be lo tirtzach in Hebrew, which is literally don't kill, or don't murder, could be don't, period. Murder.
Yeah.
You have the notion as if there is some scriptural knowledge which you, and clarity from scripture and from your narrative that comes to you, again, and here I'm very much within a Jewish, I just don't know any scripture. The minute God's will becomes word, at that moment, human beings are interpreting it. And God is, it's by definition, the minute God becomes personified through word, again, I'm not, the minute God expresses himself through word, at that moment, we're there. Now, when we're there, what are we doing? And if you want it to be internal to the system, it can't. It can't. The word is there and is given to you, and unless you know how to interpret it, unless you know which narrative and which story is the one that's going to win, your tradition's going to go off a cliff. So it's true. Now, putting God, and here's personal, I really don't like to be provocative. No, the truth is, it's true, it comes naturally. But no, it is the way maybe I was raised. But it doesn't interest me. It's like it's not it. I'm telling you, I really believe it's not about putting our concept of God second. No, it really isn't. It's about recognizing that what God wants is first and foremost love of neighbor. That's what God wants. And that in a perfect universe, we would understand that in doing so, we're putting God first. But unfortunately, when we put God first, we don't get often enough to the second. And therefore, we have to switch the order. Maybe a day will come where we don't. But when I look at my world and I look at my community, and I'm speaking my community, first of all, there's many in my community which just have to put God on the conversation in the first place. But actually, I believe that when you create a religious tradition of putting God second, you're not either removing God from the room, you're actually creating a room and a life of faith which more people will be willing to walk into.
Okay, with that not acceptance of my correction, I will point out that Donniel's book, Putting God Second, How to Save Religion from Himself, is coming out in February. At the book table, there are cards that have a code. The code is Rapids. I think it comes from Grand Rapids. And the publisher has offered a discount if you want to order it, pre-order it now, and use that code. You'll get a 25% discount on the book. So there's your plug. Also at the book table, and I'll
From me.
Also, I'll plug later,
you?
but also books by Cynthia Campbell and Ingrid Mattson are also at the book table, and they are there actually. It's not just a card. Okay, we'll open it up to discussions and questions, please, and please keep it questions to our panelists.
Question starts with a comment and goes to the question for the panelists. I understand we started with the rabbi who spoke, and then each of the other panelists explained how you have differences because you are different religions. And I do understand religion categorizes people. If we had 3 doors here, one Muslim, one Christian, and one Jewish, the whole group would not go into one door, we would go into separate doors. And as soon as you go into separate doors, it causes problems. I think that's one of the problems with religion. The question that I have for all of you is that I think that in the monotheistic religions that each of you represents, and Fred, the Hinduism, if we added him, there's a commonality that each of you believes that we're not alone, there's something, whatever it is. And there's a commonality as far as ethics or morality is involved in each of the religions that everybody here has. Why not stress, why not have in the modern day, right now, stress the commonality instead of the differences? Too often we stress the differences. And there are commonalities. I ask you, and I firmly believe that I've done corporate governance where you have a meeting, everyone talks about problems, and then you talk about how we're going to solve the problem. And you come out with something. I believe that if the 3 of you sat down for an hour with the assignment to write 3 sentences that should start every prayer service in every religion, you could actually, within an hour, come up with the same sentences for Christianity, Hindu, Islam, and Judaism.
Okay, I think we got the question. Why don't we stress commonality? What is the role of having our differences? And this is something that we face in the Kaufman Institute. There's always that pressure. And we have argued that it's important to be open about the differences. And as we do that, but I'd like to hear the panelists' response.
Very briefly, do you agree that there's such commonality that you could come up with a prayer to start every service, every religion, the same way?
Okay, let's get their response. Please let them respond. Who wants to start off?
Well, I'll start. I think it's true, and would be, I think, especially between the three of us, that one could find considerable commonality around the notion of that the basis of the religious life has to do with love of God and neighbor, I guess would be one way to put it, or the way in which the Hillel example, lots of us use that as a fundamental principle. I think that, and there's really good reason for religious people to search for and begin to try to express common ground. There's also something really important about understanding how it is that each tradition might get to that common ground. Because a religion isn't just the end point, it's really a lifestyle, in my opinion. And we may get to the same point, but we may come at it from slightly different perspectives, and listening to that carefully is an incredible learning experience. Every time I listen to Donniel walk through a way of thinking, I find myself thinking, that's so interesting. I wouldn't come at it quite that way. Well, that helps me understand both my own tradition and maybe some skills and some moves I could make inside of my own tradition that don't come as naturally. So I think that the distinctions really have always been, in my experience, a way of deepening and grounding, expanding my own religious understanding.
Do you want to respond?
I think there's two ways to look at how people can be united, and one is by saying that they should all be the same, right? So the equating unity with uniformity, and the other is to say that that true unity or peace or harmony comes through accepting diversity. My intellectual mentor, Fazl Rahman, who taught at the University of Chicago for many years, said about Islam that I think could be said about religious life as well, or religion. He said, Islam is simple, but it's not simplistic. And usually looking for a simple solution actually means that some groups have to capitulate to the ones or fit themselves into the model that's set by the dominant group. Mm-hmm. And that is actually one of the most common reasons for conflict, is that the majority sees themselves as neutral, as sort of a neutral setting or discourse or language, and everyone else, what's wrong with everyone else? Why don't they just, fit into it? But we express ourselves through different ways. Respect is shown in, if you're greeting someone in the United States, it is, to show respect means that you shake their hand and look at them straight in the eye. In many Eastern cultures and traditional cultures, it is disrespectful to look at someone straight in the eye. That a respectful posture is to actually lower your gaze. So which one is it? It's both. It's respect. Both of them are demonstrations of respect, but there are two different ways of doing it. So looking for simple solutions usually means exerting undue force in relationships. And I think what we need to do is to be comfortable with complexity, with diversity, with nuance, and that in fact that's the way, and it takes time and it takes patience but that is the way to result in a lasting and true sense of comfort with each other and the ability to find those overlapping areas of consensus.
Let's take it. You want to add something?
Amen.
Okay. We have a long line here and a long line here, so let's keep the questions short and the responses a little shorter too. And we have a lot ahead of us here. Please.
You're so good. It's just a pleasure.
Oh, thank you. Hello. I want to thank everybody for their courage. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking how brave everyone is to take a look at the dark side of our beautiful traditions of religion. And especially Dr. Hartman, I think you're very courageous. So thank you. I've noticed, and I feel it in myself often, a disillusionment with religion because of all of this nitpicking and all of the fuss and the we're right, you're wrong, we're better, you're worse. What I would like to see, and I think we're touching on it already, is that I would like to see evolution in religion. And those are words that maybe are not usually put together. But what I would like to see is a movement in all of humankind to start to believe that really the truth is there is no other.
Okay, thank you. Anybody got to pick that up?
I think we're getting there, actually, and it's the way, I mean, even to talk about religion itself as a category that we all fit into is something that has developed over time. Religious people didn't think of themselves always as necessarily belonging to a broader category of religion, or if they did, they thought of it in a hierarchical sense. My view and what I teach and preach is that, and I believe it's Quranic as well, is that I see religious identity or religious community like a like family identity. So I have my nuclear family and I have my extended family. And I'm embedded in these relationships, and some of these relationships are more intense and close and personal, and I have more responsibilities towards those within my nuclear family, and I spend more time with them. But I also like to visit, you know, my cousins and my extended family sometimes too. And we have some things in common, and some things we've gone, you know, different ways. You can see the family recipes, you know, take a bit of a different flavor. And I remember meeting my cousins in third cousins or something in Belgium and being shocked by some facial resemblance of one of my cousins with my brother, and just like, oh, that's so bizarre. And I feel that way sometimes when I go in other houses of worship. I see that kind of resemblance. So I think it is if facing specificity is not helpful, but recognizing the embeddedness in relationships is also realistic, because even historically, our practices, our architecture, our literature has interacted. None of our religious traditions, developed within silos. So they were all interacting at various times and influencing. So I think that's a way to get beyond the other is maybe just to reconceive how we understand what a religion is. That's my view.
Okay, next question.
Thank you. Dr. Hartman, as you were speaking, I was thinking of one of our previous events where the summary of that might be that in order for religion to be viable, we have to care for the peoples of the earth, all of them, and care for the earth itself. And in trying to process that, with hearing you today, I was caught up in the dilemma, maybe just because right now I'm an American, we're in an election, the struggles between working that out as an individual and trying to work that out with a community that can actually be effective at a time when what we're doing is to try to collect the number of Twitter hits that we get on any concept. And so it's I would like to hear your comments on how do we build a viable community to do and to carry out what you are talking about.
Okay, thank you.
It connects. Some of my response connects to some of the remarks that were both of Cynthia and Ingrid beforehand. Part of the way in which we are going to find how to move together is when different people of goodwill, are working together within the context of their community to a common end. There's some moments we're all going to become together, but and you see this in it. But if we're going to wait for those moments, it's going to be very, very difficult. There is a concept in the Jewish tradition called tikkun olam, to repair the world. Hate the concept. Can't stand it. And I know, talk about being controversial. That's in the Jewish tradition, saying you're against tikkun olam is worse than saying you're against God. I hate it because it's too big. And it doesn't, I share your pain. In other words, I don't know how for all of us to get together and to move forward. I don't know how to do it. What I do know is how I get up in my small neighborhood, and I know, and then find my friends. And I don't know if we could do it. Maybe we can. Maybe there's some things we could do together, but there's a lot of things that we're going to meet at the end, at the goal line. And part of each one recognizing that it's on you. It's on you. I can't repair the world. I can work on parts of the Jewish community. I can't fix Islam and Christianity. I can't join together. I can't. It's not, nor, here we're the representatives of, but you might know this, and I hope I'm not shattering anybody's fantasy. We're not the representatives of our religious traditions. Again, they selected us very, very carefully, and it's truly an honor to be here. But there are some people within our religious traditions who might think differently about some of the things that we're mentioning here today. There is, at least it's plausible. You have to take that at least as a possible notion. But it's like part of it is that we have to create a community of people who have a similar end goal. And then just let go and get up in the morning and do what you have to do. It's when you don't, it's when people don't get up and feel that it's on them, but that we're at this stagnation because we can't all do it together, that then we don't know how to move forward from it, and we get stuck there. And so again, get out of North America. I'm speaking from the context that I live in. I can't fix the Middle East. Can't do it. I'm trying. Love to. I have dreams of doing it. I have dreams of people electing me as Prime Minister of Israel.
You got to run first.
I knew there was a problem. My wife would divorce me. Other things would happen. But and that somehow I would just give a speech, and the lion will now begin to reside with the lamb. It's not going to be. I don't know how to fix the Middle East, but I could take responsibility on the moral failures of my community. Are they the ones who are sole responsible? No, of course not. Oh, and so when we're dancing, when we think that everything is, we're all trying to put the blame. No, I can't fix it. But could I work on the 5,000 people every month who come through my doors? Could I work on the 100 this? Could I work here? And so, It's a community of goals who act very, very separately, which will ultimately repair the world.
At the risk of going from theology to meddling, but since he started with the discussion about being in a political time here, I think one of the things our religious traditions could do would be to spend more time talking about the notion of a common good.
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems to me that ethical notion is no longer as vibrant in the United States, now thinking about our context, than it once was. And if we let that go, we're cooked. And religious traditions, all of us could do a lot to just raise that topic up a bit more robustly.
Here's my question. As I observe Rabbi Hartman talking about God intoxication and God manipulation, my thought was that it's a matter that human beings, we aren't willing to give up control. That we expect that we have perfect knowledge, or we can achieve some perfection of knowledge that will give us the right to claim territory and perspectives that don't belong to us, they belong to God to begin with. So the question I have is, first of all, in any of your traditions, is there a place where we ought to simply, as human beings, finite human beings, theologically and in terms of belief, be willing to give up control and say the control is not ours, the control is God's? And is there some mystery that we just have to say at some point, we leave it in God's hands, and should that be part of our common moral value system?
Thank you.
First of all, I'm never going to say the Shahadat again and understand it the way I used to, as distinct from the way I always get la 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 la. I get to I get to the end, and I didn't stop sufficiently at the beginning, which is a gift that you've already made it worthwhile to be here. It was just a gift that I'm going to take with me for many, many years, because a big part of my religious life is, I call it God as the great humilifier. That the first lesson of that Genesis 1 is not the story of the creation of the world. Genesis 1 is Judaism's introduction to Judaism. And it introduces the first and primary player in that drama called God. And the first lesson of Genesis is not that God created the world, but that God was not created. And therefore creating an infinite gap which could never be breached. That when God enters into the room, that the fundamental religious instinct is to understand that you're not God. Very, very much so. And when, God, that religious spirit could be a profound catalyst for moral life. In other words, God can be manipulated to be a force for good, can be manipulated to be a force for evil, and the concept of God could be a profound force for good. Which one we choose is, as in every case, is in our hands or in our hearts. Yes, very much so.
Okay, next.
I have a rather short question. Hopefully it brings us back to the real world of the individual, the human being. I'd like to know from each of you, how does your tradition deal with the satanic foe or the dark force, however you'd like to describe him? How do you deal with his domain, or how do you want the individual to deal with his domain? Can you teach the individual to deal with this dark force's domain, with his interaction with a human being, with his interaction with our minds, our activities, and our very lives?
Well, I'll start by saying I don't think there is a demonic region or force. To think that is that sets up a dualism, a notion of two forces of powers of good and evil. That notion has been a part of Christian tradition. It's also been declared as heretical, as a path we do not want to take. We use that, some Christians use that language. In my way of looking at the world, God is not countered by a counterforce. The goodness of God is not countered by a counterforce of evil that's external from humans. I think we are the source of the problems. And to personify evil as something outside of us is finally, in my mind, a moral abdication of responsibility. That's a little harsh, but that's kind of where I would say.
So I'll take a contrary view. Evil is there is evil, and evil is what we do. Evil actions can be identified. Also, Satan is clearly personified in the Quran, in my tradition. At the same time, Satan is one among many influences in our lives that can be positive or negative, and he's in the side of the negative. That includes our own desires and inclinations and friends and others that we have a choice to listen to or not to listen to. And that is why it's not a moral abdication. In the Quran, Satan, there's a sort of description of what will happen on the Day of Judgment when people are being held accountable for their actions, and people will point to Satan and say, he made me do it. And he will say, I had no influence over you. It was your choice to listen to me or not. So we do have free will, and we decide whether we're going to listen to our impulses to do good, or our heart, or our conscience, or our impulses to satisfy our desires at the expense of others and hurt others. It's too long of a discussion to sort of get into more why it may be helpful or harmful to have a personification of evil, but Satan actually isn't a personification of evil in the Quran. Let me say, he has some good things in him too, but he chose and tries to encourage us to join his methodology of giving in to arrogance and pride rather than humility. So I guess I could leave it at that.
One of the really nice things about interfaith programs is that I don't know where you are, sir, but I don't know what you intended, but I know what I heard as a Jew. And a Christian could hear one thing, and it might have nothing to do with what... I didn't hear at all the issue of duality. I said, how do you confront evil? That's what I heard as a Jew. Now, you might be much more, again, what the intent of the question was. How do we deal with the dark forces that are in our religious tradition, that are part of our community? And one of the ways, and I just want to, there's so many things that could be said and talked about, but I want to just share one of the ways that I feel are most critical. When you say to the people, the dark forces within your tradition, that you are distorting the tradition, you've lost. You're speaking to yourself, but you're not speaking to them. One of the things that we all have to confront is that those dark forces are in our tradition. And when we say to them that you're distorting it, we have no ability to ever bring the forces of darkness over to the forces of light. Because they are embedded and they have the sources to quote, and more often than not, tragically, their source reference is more literal than ours. We have a move, it's a this, it's not what God meant. I could tell you a story, and by the time I'm 15, it's like you're gone. They said, look what it said. No, he didn't mean, it's there. Well, we have to understand the way in which we confront the forces of darkness is to recognize that I could speak within Judaism that we have an intercultural war going on in Judaism today. An intercultural war over what Judaism is going to be. And it's an inner one. And it's a battle between Genesis 18 and Genesis 22 and Leviticus 19 and Leviticus 25, and between Deuteronomy 20 and Deuteronomy 4. Like, there's all there. They're all there. And that they're inside. Now, part of what happens is that we have to fight these forces of darkness. The other things that we do, and this is also in medicine, at the first stage, we have to stop their spreading because they're contagious. And they're contagious precisely because people believe that they're inside the tradition and they're authentic. And when you say they're not, it's precisely what Cynthia said before and about us having to take responsibility for it. And so the way in my tradition that I am working to fight the forces of darkness is to declare a cultural war. And I declare it all the time, over and over again. And I ask people to join forces. And that we have to fight for the Judaism that we want. And we have to fight for the Judaism of gentleness and kindness. And at first stage, make sure that the forces of darkness don't spread. 2, make sure that you have a coalition against them. And then when you have a coalition against them, then we can begin a process of healing our tradition from within.
Okay, we all have our favorite Bible verses. Mine is Micah 6:8. Do justice, love tenderly, walk humbly. That's what God requires. So, but I agree with you that words limit God, tend to limit God and anthropomorphize. Every time we say God, he, maybe the creator of all that is a lot bigger than what'll fit between our ears. So given all that, why do we care about the stories we tell ourselves about God? And what in the heck is the value of dogmas, creeds, theology? All of those are words, aren't they?
What's the value of?
Dogmas, doctrines, theology, creeds.
Okay. While they're thinking, I'll just remind you that this evening, each of them are going to be addressing a particular passage from their own scriptures, from the Jewish, the Christian Testament, and from the Quran, that deal with this topic. We'll have copies of the text for you, but it's going to be an example of how to do the hermeneutics on Scripture, very much related to what we've talked about.
I'm just going to, while we're thinking, I'll tell you that I'm interested primarily in ethics, and I used to have no patience for theology whatsoever. I really thought it was really, counting the angels on the head of a pin kind of thing. Really had no patience whatsoever until I studied the history of theology and why certain questions were discussed at certain times, and realized that theology is like emergency medicine. It comes in to correct bad ideology. Like, you need good theology. You need the good theology only to correct bad theology and bad ideology. So that's where I believe dogma and creed and all of these things are necessary, because there are a lot of bad ideas that come out and then become destructive. And I found theology increasingly helpful when I'm trying to argue against, the forces of darkness. I wish I didn't need it. I wish I could just do the ethics, but these things are necessary.
In the Jewish tradition, there's almost no dogma or creed. Doesn't exist. Few people tried, and they said, this is the creed. And people said, who are you to say this is the creed? And so it's interesting when you're a Jew, you're living in an almost boundaryless tradition. There's been no universally accepted declaration either of dogma or creed. And it creates profound challenges. We don't have a shahadat. We don't have any creedal statement. We don't have them. And it's one of the reasons why most Jews, for example, take it as self-evident that they could be a good Jew even though they don't believe in God. That's almost universally, and it's actually supported by the predominant amount of sources in the Jewish tradition. So we actually don't have it. Theology is another story, and again, it depends on whose theology. But theology is our struggle to find a place for God in our life. It's to try to make sense of and to make possible a life of faith. Theology in my own personal life is not a conversation opposite or trying to make sense of the creed or of dogma. It's trying to make sense of my life and how I make sense of the world in which I live in and what place God has for me in it. Theology is the journey of religious life, not the solving of my problems, but the place where I struggle with and see to what extent God can continue to be a partner in my life and how my psychological need for God could possibly work with my intellectual challenges of God, etc. And so theology is religious life, but it's significant other is not dogma or creed. Its significant other is my yearning for meaning.
Okay, we'll take one from this side and one from this side, and then we're going to have to break. Remember, there are 2 more sessions this afternoon, more opportunity for questions and answers, as well as this evening's session. So over here first.
I really appreciate your mentioning the common good, and that drew such wonderful applause from the audience. One of my favorite religious leaders brought that common good notion before our country in the Congress and the UN, named Pope Francis, who, without ever talking about religion, kept talking about the common good, and he drew a lot of positive response. I find it interesting we're talking about theology and not about prayer, because I think the only place we can realize the oneness that theologies hold out to us is in our own deep contemplative communing with God in prayer, which I think is what the rabbi was just talking about. One of my major mentors in my life is Thomas Merton, who, much to my surprise, was mentioned by the Pope before the Congress. Thomas Merton, a great interreligious person, has been my major mentor now for the second half of my 52 years as a priest. The first 26 years, I kind of got into theology and church and changing the church, and I found that got me almost nowhere. And so the second half, I've spent more time with the Merton vision, in which he says, we are already one. We simply imagine that we are not. What we have to do is accomplish our real unity. And how does that happen? And this is what I want to ask you.
Okay.
How does it happen for you, and how can it happen for us in prayer?
While they're thinking about their response, I know that some of you have prayer obligations throughout the day, and there is a prayer room on the other side of the registration table that is available for you for your prayers. Any other response from our panel?
Just to, as the sort of card-carrying theologian on the panel, to kind of hark back to that, I think the essence, I'll say a little bit more about this afternoon, but the essence of orthodoxy as a concept in theology is right prayer. It is authentic worship. And what that means is that reflection on God and ourselves and the world is done best out of an attitude of prayer, not as some sort of an abstract intellectual discipline. So I think your comment is in my mind well taken, that if our enterprise gets cut off from our devotional life and from a grounding in God, who is what we are not, then I think our faith can easily be perverted and tends away from the other. Maybe that's helpful.
I don't know if prayer is a corrective. We could pray for the wrong things. Part of the challenges that I have within the Jewish tradition is which prayers to recite. So I don't know if prayer is the place where we combine to join in the common good. I don't mean to put any damper on this unified love fest of oneness in a common good. And that it's all going to be found in faith. Some of our prayers stink. We want to get into particulars? Like, what are we praying for? Prayer is not the corrective. Prayer has to reflect a different religion. What is the God you meet in prayer? Mm-hmm. And you can meet the wrong God there. And so part of our challenges is not to repair the sinner, but to repair our prayer books. And to make sure that what we're praying for, in fact, reflects. So therefore, we have to do this. We're not going to heal ourselves in prayer. Prayer will reflect a healing process that takes place outside.
You want to respond?
Well, prayer's a general category or term that in my tradition could include many different kinds of things. So you could do a prayer of blessing, thanksgiving, to help guidance, to help me make a choice. There are all sorts of different kinds. But I would say that for the ritual daily prayer, the primary, I really think it depends on the person. And frankly, as a person, sometimes my prayer is so deep and connected, and I feel really, spiritual. And sometimes I feel rushed, and I'm doing it, and I'm really trying to at least have a little connection. But what it always does, it's not always a great spiritual experience, that reflects the state of my heart. But what it does is it forces me out of whatever I'm doing. It just is this force that says you are not the master of time and space. You have to pray here, 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 here. Now, you can supplicate, you can do all sorts of voluntary prayers any other time, but these times you have to pray. Convenient, inconvenient, you're in the mood, you're not, you feel spiritual, you feel annoyed, whatever it is. So for me, it's that kind of prayer is a reminder that I'm not the creator of the universe, time, space, because the time and space is determined by that. And it's great when prayer or other just acts of remembrance or being with people or not with people put us in connection with God. And that's prayer, can be prayer, and it can be many different other kinds of actions as well, or inaction.
Last question.
Thank you very much. Rabbi, I'm afraid you walked in here with a bit of an advantage. It is not in heaven. Remember? Of course you do. And the walls are not going to fall in on this room because it's full of scholars. You might want to tell that story today or tonight or whenever. But I'll just make another remark and sit down, and everybody can go eat. And that is, except me and maybe some others. But We're talking about something which, by design, has no external references which will allow us to define it. There's something in mathematics called the incompleteness theorem. You cannot define a system of mathematics that is wholly contained within itself. It must have something external. And the concepts we're talking about, I believe, are the same. But in Judaism, we have an out. It's not in heaven. It's given to humans to decide. Thank you.
Response? This is for you, I guess, Donniel.
Yes, you understand. So thank you.
Okay, it's
Glad someone does.
before we thank our presenters, I just a few announcements of logistics. Restrooms are off that way to your left. The lunches will be off to the right. And if your name tag says lunch on it, it means you've paid for lunch and you're ready to go. If it doesn't and you're still interested, there may be a few extra. Check at the registration table. We may have a few extra lunches. And then remember, those of you who didn't get their questions today, get on the front of the line for our sessions this afternoon. And now let us thank our participants again.